And just by a quick way of introduction, Phil is one of our colleagues from Indiana. He's presented this information all over the country. He's absolutely wonderful. The Community Agenda National Initiative includes 5 sites. Arizona is one, and Indiana is another. So we're really happy to have Phil join us on the webinar this morning. Thank you, or this afternoon. Thanks so much, Phil.
Oh, you're welcome, Amy. And I think very highly of the work you folks are doing in Arizona. It actually goes back several years, and this new flowering of the work is really pretty exciting. And I've been out there a couple of times over the last 10 years to follow what you're up to, and I'm always impressed. So thank you for inviting me today. I have to preface my remarks by a couple of things. I'm not an old hand at webinars. The program I have today
has left the conference.
Oops. See, somebody's already left.
Please don't take it personally.
Yeah. I'm not an old hand at webinars. The program today is very visual, actually. I have a lot of photos. So I regret if somebody's just listening and not watching the slideshow that it may be inadequate for their purposes. However, since it's being archived, I guess that's a way of going back and redressing that issue. Today we're talking about storytelling, and I would like to make the point that it's as much about story, as much about listening as it is about telling, and more specifically, engaging the community in such a way that people can share stories and learn from them and build relationships.
Yes.
And
has joined the conference.
Welcome. And stories, I think, are very, very important in our daily lives, and I think we're increasingly appreciating the role that stories do play. In a way, if you think about it, stories both reflect and reinforce the grand narrative about aging that we have in this country. I'll get into that a little bit more. But in effect, stories create the world.
Has joined the conference.
Claude Lévi-Strauss used to say myths are good to think. So they don't just represent, they actually represent a way of thinking. And some of you may know the work of George Lakoff, a wonderful book called Metaphors We Live By, who is a linguist who talks about how metaphors are important in creating the world that we live in. There is a grand narrative about aging that I wanted to propose, as well as an alternative narrative about aging. And I think on the left side of the chart, you see the common way that aging is typically represented in our culture. I'm going to gloss this as a medical model of aging, where the characteristics of this grand narrative involve reimbursement for acute care, a disease model of old age, a focus on longevity and anti-aging medicine, a focus on disease research and cure, a diagnosis where the person of interest is called the patient, and the way we respond to the community needs is through something we call services. And I would suggest there's an alternative way of thinking about aging in community that emphasizes reimbursement for chronic care, sees aging as a natural process, focuses on the quality of remaining years rather than the quantity, focuses on care and prevention and function, where the person that is of interest to us is a community member, and then what we do is community building. And so there are a host of different stories that we create and utilize in constructing these grand narratives about aging. And I have to say that in many ways we're still sort of leaning to the left side of that chart, if you will. But I think that there are ways to create alternative narratives about aging, engage communities in creating some different stories that help us think about aging in a different way. And stories are so important. The poet Gary Snyder has a wonderful book called Turtle Island, some of you may know about, and it draws its title from Native American mythology. And if you can imagine that picture at the beginning of the slide of an old grandfather talking to his child on his lap, and the child is wondering what keeps the world up, what holds everything up, my world that we're in. And the grandfather says, well, it sits on the back of a turtle. The little boy thinks about it for a little while, and he says, well, what's the turtle sitting on? And the old man says, well, another turtle. And the little boy says, what's that turtle sitting on? And the old man says, it's a little turtle. This goes on for a while, and at one point the old man said, well, you just have to realize it's turtles all the way down. And that's the way I feel about stories. I think it's stories all the way down. If we're going to use stories, it's important to know what makes a good story. And on the slide are some bullet points that describe the elements of a good story. Not every story has all of these elements, but if you can think about how to support the creation of stories with some of these elements, you'll live in a richer, storied environment. And there are a million ways to gather stories. And that's basically the focus of my presentation today, is to talk about a lot of different ways to gather stories. And I'm going to be mentioning a number of different projects that we've done in Bloomington and ripping through a number of slides so that we can get to some conclusions at the end. Each project that I show has a different colored background, and the first slide of each project shows you the name of the funding source that we tapped into for that particular project, because you'll see if you're doing this kind of work, you really have to draw on some non-traditional funding sources. We wanted to better understand what the meaning of home and neighborhood among older adults in Bloomington. You can see this project was quite a long time ago. And one of the ways we gathered stories from older people and young people was through a creative writing project. It was done over a period of about 12 weeks. A group of elders at a nutrition site and a group of children in one elementary classroom went through a number of writing exercises to write about their experiences, their notion of home, their ideas about neighborhood and community. And we learned very many important things about this topic through these stories. And this is an example from a fifth grader who wrote about a cemetery she visited, and the stories that she'd like to make up stories about the people who lived in the cemetery. And this brought out of her a sense of stewardship over the stones as well, which is important to note. We involve kids at the alternative school in interactions with elders with dementia at the adult daycare center, and that involved the creation of collages and the telling of stories around a collage project. And this particular discussion was focusing on front porches. And Bertha DeBoer here, who was 100 at the time, we got a wonderful quote from her we could incorporate into the project and onto the poster. You don't need to do anything special on a porch. You can do what we did, talked. That's enough. We involved kids from another alternative school in Bloomington called Harmony School to interview elders in the neighborhood around the school. They sat down and came up with almost 10 pages of questions that they wanted to ask older people around the neighborhood. We put them through a simulation exercise to improve their communication skills with older adults. And they met people like Martha, who actually met them at the door in her dealy bobbers, if you remember what those are, and told them a lot of stories about her life and her profession as a dancer. Wonderful experience for everybody. You pick up some wonderful quotations that you can use in discussing issues in your community and helping explain the daily lives of older people and young people through this kind of work. These are a couple of quotes from interviews that the kids did with people that that they met as a part of their project. And I won't read the interviews, the quotations, just in the interest of time, because there's actually a story behind each of these quotations that's important to tell. We also did actually ethnographic work with a number of older people in the town, and Elizabeth Bridgewater's talked to us about the importance of choice in designing environments. And she lived across the street from this community center. She was an African-American woman, sat on her front porch, interacted with kids at the end of the day as they walked by. And the community center was the former, quote, colored school in Bloomington that was built in 1938 by WPA and was desegregated in the mid-1950s. And learned a lot about the neighborhood through that project. You can do a graffiti wall. This is one we did as part of the same project. We took a giant piece of paper, and at the top we asked the question, what makes a neighborhood a good place to live? And within a few days we had it completely filled. We had to put up another one, and it was filled also. That and the collage project constituted a special exhibit at our local arts center there, along with other kinds of artifacts. This is another way of gathering stories, which is to a different project, actually, a different funding source. We were doing interviews about the closure of a state developmental hospital, and we constructed a timeline with significant events and then invited in the public, and the public then can write their stories along the timeline a little bit easier for them, because then they can engage with specific pivotal events of that particular institution. Of course, that would work for any kind of community issue or institution, or if you were gathering stories about a school or a hospital or a particular neighborhood and can construct a timeline with photos, then it makes it a more engaging activity and is a terrific way to get people talking, and also providing some documentation that's valuable. At the end of the creative writing project, we brought the kids and the elders together for a celebration. They read their stories to each other, and that was done in conjunction with the arts exhibit that I mentioned. And we took the stories, created an edited volume that was a wonderful book called Experiencing Place that was published by Bloomington Hospital, and this has, again, been quite a while ago. One of the wonderful quotes that we retrieved from participants in the daycare program was through a group poetry exercise organized around home and neighborhood. And if you can imagine a group of elders with dementia coming together and a facilitator drawing upon what they say to create a poem about a very important theme here. And I actually use this poem a lot in trying to understand the concept, or get across the concept of home. I have several homes. I know a home is a home when I can go there, stay, and go out again. Home is where the dog goes when it gets too cold to roam. When winter's coming on, that's when I want to go home. And those kinds of objects, if you will, or artifacts of life, help us tell a different story about home. And the one that's often told in the Aging Network is this kind of poster child rendition of aging. You know, the picture of an elderly, vulnerable woman, maybe a widow, looking out a window, looking kind of depressed and lonely. Sometimes that's the story that we tell about aging. And in some ways, the grand narrative that I talked about supports those kinds of stories. But maybe there are some other stories and other notions that we can tell about aging. In fact, I think the story that we need to tell is that aging in place, or aging in the home, is the same thing as aging in community. There's one story there. There should be one story there, and not two different stories. So some of the other projects that we've done help, in my mind, reinforce that notion. This is a different project. It's a map-making project that involves kids doing a walkabout in their neighborhood and interviewing elders and noting the characteristics of the neighborhood. We always start with a map-making exercise where the kids draw pictures of their own home and their own neighborhood. before actually going out into the neighborhood on the walkabout. And we put those on the wall, and we come back to them after the end of the day. We recruit a lot of chaperones from the neighborhood. We put together a notebook that the kids use to document their walk. Sometimes we send them in different directions with different kinds of instructions. But this one was one that we did around the Fairview Elementary School in Bloomington. One group went out to this White Oak Cemetery, saw this wonderful tombstone of a fellow who fought in the Indian War, so-called Indian War. They visited this house that was being moved by Bloomington Restorations to a new lot, and it's now actually a visitable lot on a visitable site about 2 blocks away across the street from a park. But it was the residence of this guy, who was the Reverend Ernie Butler, and the pastor of our Second Baptist Church, a fellow that knew Martin Luther King and had an opportunity to interact with the students when they came by on their walkabout. He brought them into the church where they could ring the bell, which was kind of a fun thing, except for that one kid in the back there who's a little dour. So we asked them to look at natural elements in the neighborhood. We gave them cameras so they could take pictures, like of this hole in the tree and the kid who stuck his hand in there. I would never do that. We asked them to look for where the water is in the neighborhood. They took a picture of what one kid told us what we call the secret Amazon, and he made me promise never to tell anybody where this is, because that's their secret place. They thought this tree was rather interesting, which I think it is as well. We asked them to take pictures of houses and what people did in their houses and on their porches and in their yards, basically to pay attention to their environment. And they came across this unusual homemade sculpture, which is sort of nifty. They went by the community center that Elizabeth Bridgewater's viewed on a daily basis and learned a little bit about the WPA. They collected objects along the way for a little found art museum that we put back together at the end of the day in the gymnasium where we met. And this was one of the elders they had interviewed, Wyatt Buca, who came to the charrette and brought along something that he was very proud of. He's standing in front of the giant map that we constructed that the kids used to annotate after their walk, to put things that they noticed and discoveries they made. And then we all sat down and debriefed the session, and we asked the question, what makes a neighborhood a good place for young people and old people at the same time? And they came up with actually some very insightful observations, one of which was really good sidewalks. And they wanted a barber shop in the neighborhood. They thought a swimming pool in the neighborhood would be a very cool thing that would work for both for kids and elders. And they wrote these down. We call them big and cool ideas. That's not my phrase. That's a friend who's an architect at Ball State University who came up with that phrase. But it's kind of neat. And then, of course, we all sat down for a group photo at the end of the day. This is a different project. This is our courthouse in Bloomington, 1906 Beaux-Arts building that still stands and has been preserved. It's a gorgeous building. But we were interested in the town square and the role of the town square in our community, and thought it would be important to explore the role of the town square in the community. And this was a different source of funding that we had. We set up shop actually in the college mall to create simulacrum of Kirkwood and Walnut, which was the address for our town square, and invited people in to tell their stories about the town square. We call them fish stories because there's a fish. Let me go back a couple. On the right-hand picture, you can see the fish at the top of the courthouse, which was cast was on the previous courthouse and cast in the late mid-19th century by a local industrialist. So we call them fish stories, and we collected fish stories. We had pictures, archival pictures of the square to provoke memory. So people could point to a building and say, you know, this is where I shopped, this was the Five and Dime, this is where we went for the lunch counter, that kind of thing. And involved graduate students also in the interviewing there. We created posters, had done some interviews with people that had shops around the square and created these posters and set up a line that you could call to actually dial in the number, and then you could hear the audio version of the interview while you're standing in front of the store where Bud Ferris was actually talking about the history of the store. This was another project around the 3rd Street Park downtown. I'm getting an echo. Is everybody okay?
We hear the echo, but we can hear you just fine.
Okay. We were interested in trying to build some senior housing around this park. It was kind of an intergenerational environment with a Boys and Girls Club across the street. So we thought it would be valuable to collect, to document the history of the park and sort of address the past, present, and future of the park. And we recruited high school students in this process, and they did interviews with elders, and they observed people in the park. They met with the Parks and Recreation Department. We set up a display in one of the community centers to pull people in and get them talking about what they did in the park. This is a fellow who told some stories about breaking into the park where the swimming pool was and skinny dipping with his friends. The police came. He got away, but one of his friends didn't. And it was a great story, and the kids wrote a play about the park, and that was one of the stories they incorporated into their play that they gave to the community. This project was called the Crestmont Discovery Project, and it's another walkabout. This is our public housing neighborhood called Crestmont, and we wanted the kids to meet some of the elders in the neighborhood and learn more about their environment. And we started again with a map-making exercise. Kids drew maps of their neighborhood. We found that the kids usually drew what you call elevations in their first maps, rather than bird's eye view type maps. At the end of the day, they were able to relate to a GIS map of the city in a kind of a different way that they weren't able to relate to at the beginning of the exercise. It was kind of interesting. So this is a 3-day project. We called it an adventure walk. We kind of organized it around the theme of the rabbit and Alice in Wonderland, and we put together a little notebook they could use to record their observations as they went through the neighborhood, and gave them cameras. It's a kind of a photo voice technique that some of you probably heard about before. And they met Mary Harris, had a wonderful time with her, and she explained to them her history in the neighborhood, how she used to pitch softball for the kids, and they really enjoyed her garden. She had a beautiful garden outside of her unit in public housing. They came back and annotated the big map with their observations from the walkabout, and put together another set of big and cool ideas, which they offered at a presentation at the Boys and Girls Club. And their big and cool ideas included more gardens like Mrs. Harris. They had a dumpster in the neighborhood they wanted moved away. They wanted more park benches for old people, and they thought people should be nicer to each other in their neighborhood. So that last one, we took those ideas to the National Night Out. Had a little voting thing where people could put beans in jars, and you can see the results of the voting for the big and cool ideas that we gathered. That's National Night Out in public housing, and they had a bicycle parade, and we learned really how important bicycles were to kids in the neighborhood. And that helped organize a discussion about how people could be nicer to each other. And it culminated in a conversation with kids at the Boys and Girls Club, which is a converted townhouse in the neighborhood. And the kids decided that they wanted it to be more welcoming, and they wanted people to know that the Boys and Girls Club was there when people drive by. So Joe LaMantia is a public artist that we hired on a contract. he had them start drawing pictures of bicycles. And then he took all these pictures, hooked them together into one drawing, converted them to a giant piece of paper at the Boys and Girls Club, and the kids transferred the bicycles to this giant piece of paper. And then that became the template for a visit to the salvage yard, where the owner of the salvage yard let us pick out things that the kids could use to create bicycles. So the kids picked the items and hooked them together. And then we took them to a welder and created these bicycles, recycled bicycles. And the kids were responsible. We brought them all back. Kids were responsible for getting the rust off the bicycles. And then the bicycles were painted. The kids did color studies. They used the color studies then to paint the bicycles, so it was done in a kind of an ordered fashion. And that was a lot of fun. We set up a scaffold in the neighborhood there and suspended the bicycles so as people were walking by, they could see kind of what was going on. We didn't have a lot of luck with that project involving family members in the project too much. And some people kind of got really creative with their paint. Then we had a celebration. We poured footers. The bicycles were all welded together after they were painted, put together a celebration, and this is the bicycle arch in front of the Boys and Girls Club with the symbol of the Boys and Girls Club in front of the arch. And we had a ribbon cutting where the mayor spoke, and we had a lot of folks there who were involved with the project. So it was really a very, very satisfying thing. And it does create a more welcoming entry to the Boys and Girls Club, as you might guess. So why is it important to share stories? I think it's very, very important. I think it's a way to counter the decline that sometimes we see in community engagement. It gets more people involved with community change, so it kind of broadens the accountability. It helps people find a way to engage in community development processes, and it provides an alternative way of providing what public officials sometimes call input, which to me is a very unsatisfactory term to describe the highest level of citizen participation that we need in our community change efforts. It's a way of bringing in diverse audiences because it provides them some alternative ways to be engaged. It helps frame issues, particularly with respect to this notion of what is home all about for older people. Those are very important learnings that we had. And it builds the democracy with a small d. And so there are lots of good reasons. There are some really excellent outcomes that you can achieve relative to understanding the daily experiences of old people and other groups, understanding the impact of programs on people, and discovering and revealing to a wider audience the needs, skills, talents, and assets of individuals and groups who might otherwise be invisible to the mainstream public and to persons in power. It's a wonderful way of gathering and organizing diverse individuals and groups into processes designed to create a shared vision of a better future. Simply helping a community learn about itself is a wonderful outcome. And you can see that in many ways it's about creating events in which stories are shared and not just storytelling events, if you will. There are lots of resources for doing story circles and life history projects, oral history projects, and so forth. But I think it goes farther than that. It's a way of thinking about community engagement and the role that stories can play as they help pull people together and they emerge from community engagement activities. So it's not using stories to promote your program. It's engaging people in stories, which is a way of engaging your program in the community. And that has those kinds of positive benefits. So it's not a marketing tool. I've provided a list of criteria that you can use for selecting different kinds of storytelling techniques that might be important to you. Practical things like cost and how diverse is the audience. It can be real challenging if we're thinking about bringing in Native Americans or people with disabilities or homeless people or other disfranchised groups. And again, some practical questions for thinking about that are helpful to think through before you develop a storytelling project of some kind or other. These are some resources. This is a project we do called the Museum of the Person, where we gather some of our stories onto our website at museumoftheperson.org. That links with another project we have, which is a disability history project. We've been gathering stories about disability in our story tent for a number of years, and you can go to our YouTube station, CAC Voices, to download stories. A lot of them about disability, but also about other subjects. We have a 10-minute video on the mapping project that I talked about that you can download from the hyperlink here on the slide. We have a 15-minute video on the creation of the Crestmont Bike Arch, which is fun to watch. We do a lot of videography in the projects that we're involved with, and because it gives you some good products that you can use for a long time. I wanted to refer to this storytelling white paper that Barbara Ganley has written for the Orton Family Foundation, which is some good practical information on story circles and other kinds of storytelling techniques. My book, Elderburbia, has a chapter on participation, the key to the community building, and that's available through ABC Clio Press or Amazon, and that's available to you as well. And my contact information and our center websites are the last slide in the slide deck here. So I'm going to stop there. I've pretty much taken all the time, and so I'll turn it back to Amy, and you can make the call as to whether you want some discussion or we can just do that from here on out by some other means.
No, I think we definitely have time for some questions. And thank you so much, Phil. That was wonderful. It just made me really eager to hear more about the stories. I do have a request for people on the phone. If you have the phone on speaker, it does create kind of an echo effect. So if anyone's on the phone and you have us on speaker, if you could please put us on mute or pick up the receiver and take us off speaker, that would be great. It sounds like, oh, no, maybe not. There we go. Okay. Questions for Phil? Anyone around the table or on the phone? Phil, I've got a question for you. One of the things that, and really part of the motivation for having you speak to us today, is how can we best capture the stories? How can we best reflect the stories that are occurring in our public communities, in our work, and share those? So do you have ideas for how agencies or efforts can really collect the stories and then reflect them back to the community in a really constructive way?
Yeah. Well, as you might guess, documentation becomes important in that regard. And that can be, can add work, obviously. If you're collecting stories and you want to create a written document, then you have to transcribe them. And you can use volunteers, but it's very time-consuming to transcribe an audio tape or a videotape. If you have video and you have an hour-long tape from some event, say a story circle, it has far more value if you can create clips from that video, which requires the editing of the good pieces and clipping them together. And again, that's a professional skill that can be expensive and time-consuming, but we try to do that as much as we can. We have a person on our staff who has some of those skills. And you also notice, though, that I had a few slides where I just used a quotation from an interview. And you can pull out some very, very valuable and compelling quotations. And I've used a lot of those over the years in talking about various issues in the community. For example, there's a story I tell when I'm talking about mobility and transportation and navigating traffic, and how that can be difficult for older people in our community. And so I have a quote I use from an interview that, let's see, how does it go? When I come to an intersection, I go all the way around. If I go to the one on my left, then across the street, and to the one on my right, I can't cross the street. I'm actually forgetting the actual quotation now. But we have a right turn on red law in Indiana, and it's very dangerous for people who are crossing the street with the traffic turning behind them. So this guy has a great quote about how he talks about he has to go across all 4 points of the intersection to get where he wants to go. He says things like, I never shop at that store anymore for clothes because they don't have a bench in the changing room. We don't go there because the front doors are too heavy. They're too difficult to open. You know, those kinds of quotes that come from interviews that can be very, very compelling and short and brief, and don't require a lot of effort. You can use them in public testimony, you know, that you might be having. Photos are another way of telling a story. We have done some drawings to represent stories. And again, it depends a little on what your financial resources are. I have a great drawing that I use of an older woman on her front porch, very much a part of her community because she's on her front porch. And there's a story and some quotes that go along with that drawing, and so it kind of adds value to the point that you're trying to make. Mm-hmm. So documentation is very important. There might be some ways to connect with institutions of higher education around this particular task. Fortunate in being in Bloomington, where we have one of the top folklore, one of the 2 or 3 places in the country where you can get a PhD in folklore. But you've got a wonderful anthropology department at the University of Arizona, and also at Arizona State. I forget where they are. But anthropology, folklore, sociology, the fine arts, those are wonderful places to go to look for partners to help on the documentation side.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you, Phil. And just kind of more of a technical question. Do you need releases for the photos, the stories, drawings?
Yeah, we always get releases.
Okay.
It's just good standard operating procedure. And
okay.
It's not that difficult if you can use one release sort of for multiple purposes and create a blank form and have people sign it. It's just a good practice.
Okay, great, thank you.
Of course, I'm in an academic institution, which makes it a little more difficult for us sometimes. It's just more expected of people working in academic settings than it would be elsewhere, probably.
Right. Do you have an example of when a story has been particularly impactful, when it's really led to some decisive change or activity? I think that you shared a number throughout your presentation, but if there's one in particular that really illustrates that point.
I think the story that the kids told about the dumpster in their neighborhood, we suggested that and we had an adult go with them, but 2 or 3 of them volunteered to go talk to the director of the Public Housing Authority. And they shared their story, which the specific story was that they were upset because it was right next to their playground, a big dumpster, and people from outside the neighborhood came into public housing to use the dumpster for free. And so they told the story to the public housing director, and she moved it the next day. It was small but wonderful outcome, that's just kind of the first example that comes to mind.
That's great because it's very immediate and it was really empowering. I can imagine for the kids to be involved, to have someone listen to them like that.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Other questions? Other comments? Well, Phil, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time. We're just thrilled to be able to share this with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, please know
us.
that my email's in there. Please feel free to contact me if you have a question or want more information or want me to help direct you to other resources because there's a lot.